question is it robust knowledge or make-believe? We are returning in a way to issues that have been raised over the past 2 days. And I welcome our 3 speakers here, Angela Cassidy, Tim Johnson, and Stuart Parkinson, and I will speak in that order, which is alphabetical, which it was throughout, if you haven't noticed. Unfortunately, Jerry Rabbit cannot join us today, so we got 3 panelists instead of 4. I'll hand over to Angela, who is a historian at King's College in London.
Thanks, Rainer. I should say to start with to whoever it was on Twitter who kept popping up yesterday going, oh, no more badgers, I'm afraid we are back to badgers again, but hopefully not entirely badgers. So I'm going to fire through this as quickly as I can. Firstly, I want to talk about the issue of expectations of science, of generally what it's expected that science can do in the policy-making process. So apologies to the people over here. I have a quotation here from the report by John Krebs, which was published in 1997, the ecologist John Krebs, which was the 3rd expert report or review of bovine TB within a 20-year period. Since the publication of Krebs' report, we've had at least 3 more. So that's the first thing I want to highlight, is that we keep having expert reviews on this issue, and whether it's getting us anywhere is a key question. However, Krebs reviewed the evidence in 1997, and he concluded that what was needed was a proper experimental assessment, and his definition of what a proper experiment was did not include the research that had been done so far. And as you can see the language here, to provide a sound basis for future policy. So this was published at the same time as the incoming Labour government, and a lot of the language here is clearly cross-borrowed from Labour's own discussions about evidence-based policy at the time. So he's providing quite a clear promise about what a scientific trial could do. So consequently, a very large field trial called the randomised badger culling trial was commissioned. It's arguably the largest piece of field trial research that's ever been conducted in this country, and it was essentially trying to enact the logic of a randomised control trial across a large area of the southwest. There were a lot of expectations about what the RBCT was going to do at the time. Most broadly, most actors involved in this issue at the time expected that the RBCT would provide evidence to support a culling policy. And this incidentally did include the Badger Trust, who actually opposed the RBCT at the time and argued that it was unnecessary to do this science. However, nearly 10 years and one extremely messy foot and mouth outbreak later, the RBCT concluded with conclusions that were very, very different. They argued that in part, culling conducted under some circumstances could potentially make disease problems worse. The evidence that they provided was multidisciplinary, very, very complicated, very open to contest, and very open to different interpretations of the evidence. And so since 2007, when the RBCT reported, we've seen multiple cuttings of the cake of the evidence around bovine TB. What we've also seen since the publication of the RBCT is a increasingly and very dramatically polarised public debate. This issue has always been polarised, but the numbers of people who are polarised about the issue has become very much greater. And we've also seen its entry into mainstream politics. And I think there's some interesting parallels to be drawn with particularly the US climate debate in terms of the contrast between the public face of what science is and what science is expected to be, and the internal mess of, as Latour said, science in the making, what is happening is that these two versions of science are rubbing up against each other and not necessarily helping resolve the issue. We're also seeing the issue of campaigners and activists taking very much this position of being armed with peer-reviewed science. And very, very different clashing and very passionate values about these issues. However, beyond that particular dynamic, we've also got a history here, a very, very long history of this debate. People have been arguing about badgers and bovine TB since the 1970s. And actually, badgers themselves have a very, very long history of a complicated and conflicted relationship with people. So over here, there was an episode of Yes Minister about badgers. And it wasn't about badgers and bovine TB, but it does show you that badgers have been a problem for politicians for a very long time, and actually much earlier than that as well. So this disreputable looking chap up here is from Beatrix Potter's story, which is partly about Tommy Brock, who is not a very nice character at all. And so we have these very conflicting ideas about what badgers are and whether we like them or not. And they're continuing to be mobilised within this argument about bovine TB. We have a history of the policy trajectory around badgers and animal welfare, particularly in the UK. This is a very specifically British debate, changing attitudes to animal welfare and conservation policy, which is going on in a very different trajectory. At the same time, we also have a policy history around bovine TB and animal health and how bovine TB was brought under control in the early part of the 20th century. And these, essentially what happened during the 1970s is these two very different policy agendas suddenly clashed together, and they're continuing to clash even now. And partly what I'm trying to do in this work is employing some of this work that Nick Brown and Mike Michael have done, which is about expectations of science and how ideas about what science will do in the future get deployed within policymaking debates. And most of this work has been applied to new biotechnologies and innovations, and they tend to talk about the present and the deployment of the future in the present. But what I think is going on in this particular case is we also have an ongoing deployment and reconstruction of the past in the present to talk about the future. And this is something that keeps happening. So I'm trying to sort of develop this idea at the moment. But I think it goes some of the way to understanding what's been going on here, where we have this situation where every so often, as Peter Brox in a post he was writing yesterday actually about ongoing science policy debates, he said, whenever things get really messy, somehow we press the reset button. And I'm not sure it's quite a matter of the reset button, but certainly what we're seeing is repeating cycles of policy making, evidence gathering, starting again, reviewing, doing some more science. The science is not resolving it, but people are invoking both the past and the evidence and the science in order to further their agendas on one side or the other. So finally, I've also, in the course of doing this work, spent a long time thinking about how you could possibly reframe this debate. Because what we have at a situation is at the moment is these two very, very opposed and actually mutually exclusive framings of bovine TB as on the one hand an animal health problem and an economic problem, and on the other hand of the potential solution to the first problem, i.e. culling, as a potential environmental risk. And so these two framings are very mutually exclusive, and this is partly why we have so much conflict. So thinking about how you might reframe this problem. And fundamentally, I think the key thing is a matter of actively exposing and exploring the uncertainties, the complexities and the mess of this situation. What we have seen so far is a great deal of foregrounding of the knowledge, the science, the truth, so on and so forth. But actually, if you examine this situation, the level of known unknowns about this are enormous. We have no clear understanding even of transmission of the disease amongst different species. We incidentally actually have a very little clear idea about what different members of the public think about this issue. There's a widespread circulation of what we think the public thinks, but we don't actually know. And so it's a matter of broadening this evidence base of what evidence is for policy in this. And some of this is very familiar. We need to draw on culture. We need to draw on the history. The whole issue of institutional memory, or just general memory around this, is clearly a massive problem. Bring in what is often discussed of as anecdotal evidence. So the latest Steve Bell cartoon about this situation can tell us huge amounts about what's going on in this debate and where it's going. Different sources of expertise. One thing I haven't actually mentioned is that there is also a behind-the-scenes conflict in terms of who are the relevant experts here. Are they veterinary scientists? Are they ecologists? Are they economists? Are social scientists allowed to speak about this? So on and so forth. Are farmers people that we need to listen to on this? Also, local and regional engagement. This isn't just a matter of engaging communities. There's a specific geography to this disease, and specific geographies in terms of different attitudes to animals and different attitudes to government and policy going on here. All this towards opening up these problematic framings. So over here, and behind the scenes, I think this is actually starting to happen. So DEFRA have recently commissioned ScienceWise to start doing deliberative exercises on this, and ScienceWise have produced this video which is exactly trying to do this process of opening up and showing the complexity of the debate. However, one thing I would say is that I'm only one of 45 people who've watched this video on YouTube, so there is a real question there about whether that's actually a valid thing to do in public, and at that point I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to my left to Tim Johnson, who is a mathematician from Heriot-Watt.
Yes, I'm a probabilist, and I thought I'd start by trying to explain a little bit, or give you some context of what it is to be a probabilist. A few years ago, I was at a meeting sponsored by the EPSRC and the London Mathematical Society on using mathematics to address problems in the energy domain, and we had a British academic nuclear engineer who observed that in France they don't use probabilistic arguments in support of nuclear engineering. Two of the people who didn't snigger at that point at the ignorance of the French were myself, and I sat next to the senior probabilist at Oxford, and that's because we appreciate that the French have a very different conception of probability than the British. The French see it as a branch of mathematical analysis and related to it's rational, whereas in England we tend to see it as a subset of statistics based on empirical evidence. The difference is further captured in the terminology that we use. In English, we use the phrase mathematical expectation. In France, they use the word espérance, which comes from hope. And so you immediately have a difference in attitudes. In English, we wait for the expectation. Expect has been used synonymously with wait, whereas in France, they hope. You get lots of issues related to language. As a probabilist, every time I see uncertainty on a slide or use, I have to stop and think, are they talking about what Ian Boyd described as epistemic uncertainty, or are they talking about aleatory uncertainty? That is, uncertainty in the knowledge base, or just we don't know what's going to happen. There's an issue with risk. If I talk to an economist about risk, they mean a quantifiable uncertainty. It is not what everybody else means by a risk. So there's lots of issues related to language. I sometimes distinguish mathematical probability from statistics by using the analogy of hope and faith. So hope in the sort of classical sense of spes or elpis, spes in Latin, elpis in Greek, and faith, fides, pistis. And Poincaré, I am a mathematician in the tradition of Poincaré. Poincaré observed that to doubt everything and to believe everything are two equally convenient solutions. Both dispense with the necessity of reflection. And he made a further observation that without probability, science would be impossible. Now, the point is statistics is a necessary part of science because our results are doubtful, in the same sense that theologians say that believers need faith because belief is doubtful. Probable implies provable and true, but there is a difference between statistics and probability. Statistics is built on evidence in the same way that faith is built on evidence, trust is built on evidence. There's a more rational, metaphysical aspect to probability, and this is exemplified in its origins in medieval jurisprudence, when issues of conscience and moral certainty were very important. And the actual genesis of mathematical probability was in the moral assessment of commercial contracts. So Huygens' first treatise on probability was concerned with determining the fair price of a contract, and the word ratio is the root of rational. It's about finding that equal point. And so when he used the word expectation, it was in the context as if you have a game where you win £10 on the toss of a head and £5 on the toss of a tail, its expectation, its fair price is £7.50, but you should never expect to get £7.50 because it will never happen. What I'm trying to get across is that mathematical statistics and probability exist because our claims are doubtful. And that's why they exist. But my secondary point is historically, there was an explicitly moral dimension to probability, and that was lost. I identify it with Laplace's analytic theory. You can actually identify the point at which it disappeared. And then the emergence of episteme, the Greek word episteme, which Plato described as verified true knowledge. So the question related to this panel is it episteme or make-believe? I have an issue with that question because I think the dichotomy is wrong. It's not a distinction between scientific or true knowledge and make-believe. It's a problem of, the problem we have is trying to make the best decision when we live in an uncertain, undependable world outside the controlled laboratory. Aristotle distinguished episteme, which he thought, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but it's passive knowledge, from phronesis, which is active knowledge, and thinking that was used in determining action. It was different from techne, which is technical skill and technical knowledge, but it was a more active type of thinking. And so, you know, coming to this conference is research, politics, media, and impact, I think, is more about robust thinking rather than robust knowledge. And the antonym of make-believe is not true belief, but justified belief. I think it's important to emphasize phronesis with the aim of good, virtuous living, and particularly in light of the financial crisis. For example, most of the research in financial mathematics, which is my discipline, has been focused on establishing a true price of a contract. A lot of my work, or some of my work, is about reorienting the discipline to focus on the principles of making robust decisions rather than precise or true observations, given that we live in an uncertain world. And it struck me relating to the previous speaker, I have actually presented a case that the origins of actuarial science are in the synthesis of faith, hope and charity. And so linking back to classics. A lot of, well, another motivation is, I sat in I shared when I was doing my PhD, I shared a workspace with a colleague who was doing a PhD in theoretical physics. He went off to work in a bank. I was doing a PhD in financial mathematics, applied probability, and I went off to work in academia, which is interesting in itself. But I was talking to David after, a couple of years later when he was working in a bank, and I was asking him about how they used mathematics in the bank, and he said, and it was the first time I'd heard the phrase, or the first time I'd listened to the phrase, and he said, oh, it's used as a rhetorical device. I didn't understand what it meant. He said, well, as a trader, if I have a better model than the risk manager, I can do it. And then this sat with me for a long time. It troubled me. It sat with me for a long time. But it reappeared in the Bank of England's testimony to the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards, where Andy Haldane, who Neil mentioned, and is the senior executive at the Bank for Financial Stability, said, unnecessary complexity of mathematical models is a recipe for ripping off in pulling the wool over the eyes of the regulators about how much risk is actually on the balance sheet. Now, as a financial mathematician, that is very troubling. Andy Haldane is, I've met him a couple of times, he's very measured, very respectable, very knowledgeable. For him to make that statement in front of the Parliamentary Commission, I find very disturbing as a mathematician.
1 minute.
1 minute. Where are we? More generally, I see connections here around issues of climate science. I'm a bystander on the debate, but I tend to see the debate as being dominated by who can produce the biggest pile of peer-reviewed papers wins. That's my view. It's naive. If a claim is published, it becomes fact. But the issue is, as Poincaré noted, a collection of facts is no more science than a collection of bricks is a house. Le savant doit ordonner. And I use the French because the English translation is the obligation of the scientist is to create order. And I think there's so much weight, baggage around the word scientist. Now, I shall leave by lighting the blue touch paper, firstly with an observation and then with some hyperbole. And the observation relates to a claim that Philip made yesterday. And he claimed that E equals MC squared is a fact. As a mathematician, I think it's a model. Yeah.
But it's just close to a fact as science can get.
Right.
At the moment.
Let me finish. I come from a tradition all models are wrong. But also, if you read Poincaré, he might argue, or he argued that force is a definition, or the way he did a long text. But E equals MC squared can be read as a definition. I'm lighting to read such paper. The hyperbole is, I believe, a significant contributory factor to the financial crisis, the credit crisis in particular, was an adherence to a fact-value dichotomy that was taken up by the majority of players in finance. They have a strict fact-value dichotomy. If there is a model, if there is a formula, I can do it. I don't have to think about values.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, our last speaker on the panel is Stuart Parkinson from Scientists for Global Responsibility.
Now I have to find a few slides.
this screen doesn't seem to be on.
Right. I've got a few thoughts from myself and my own organisation and some research we did, and I have some copies of the report outside, looking at a number of issues around these issues, but particularly around vested interests and the way that they can distort some of these issues. And I guess I should say right up, Scientists for Global Responsibility is an organisation of scientists, engineers, and concerned people from related disciplines. And we include natural scientists and social scientists. But we are an organisation that explicitly talks about both scientific evidence and values. And it's kind of uncomfortable for a lot of scientists that we do have one foot in each camp. But I kind of think in some of the debates that we have had over the last couple of days about being explicit about evidence and values, I think has a particular strength in tackling a lot of these issues. So the particular thing I want to talk about here is corporate influence on science and military influence on science, where we've done a lot of work. And this overarching issue, these are two very powerful interests. Although they're quite broad in many respects, they have quite narrow direction of a set of values and a sort of set of priorities, a driving force. And they have a considerable influence, and within science, at corporate level, I think it is growing. Some of the slides that were shown by, I think it was Brian Collins at the start of our session, gave some figures around the same level that I'm talking about. They fund 2/3 of R&D, which takes place within industry, not within universities, and that's a very distinct and large-scale influence. And then there's also an involvement within universities that is promoting a particular narrow, short-term, I would argue, economic agenda, which I think can distort science and technology. And then the other interest is this military area, which historically has had a very, very large influence over science and technology. And even now, the world's largest funder of R&D is the US Department of Defense. And it controls more than 50% of the public funding of science in the USA, so it has considerable influence. In the UK, we used to be in that situation in the 80s during the Cold War, and in the early years of the Cold War it was even higher. It's fallen to about 1/6 of public R&D, but it still exerts a considerable influence over particular areas, and again has quite a narrow focus. And it's interesting, there was a report published by the Defence Science Advisory Council recently, which argued that military R&D as currently funded is too narrow, and we need to spend more money in universities, getting more people involved to broaden it out so we can develop more a wider range of military technologies, which scared me rather a lot. And so there are a number of problems around particular interests, and we talk about some of these in our report. So there's issues about influence at the research study level, sponsorship bias, whereby a particular funder, whereas results of a study will reflect a particular funder, and I'll talk about some evidence of that in a minute. Commercial confidentiality restrictions, so contracts that restrict publication of research, and sometimes conflicts of interest where researchers have involvement with organisations without stating that they have those connections. Then there's the issue of public communication, and there's marketing bias where you're selling a particular product and you emphasize the benefits of those products. And then on the other hand, there's sort of getting involved in public debates and public relations campaigns to influence public viewpoints and regulation in particular. And a particular problem is doing it without being explicit that you are part of the industry, and doing it through various lobby groups. And I'll talk about a couple of examples as well. And then a sort of overarching issue is prioritising research and being able to influence the research in particular directions through the way it's funded, and working with other funders, public funders, to give higher priorities to certain areas of research over others. So a particular example here of sponsorship bias, there have been an increasing number of studies over the last few years, and a few examples looking at comparing results from studies that are funded by industry with studies that are not funded by industry, and looking at how often industry favourable results come out. So you've got some studies there. First one looked at about 400 studies and found that industry favourable results were 3 times more likely in industry-funded studies, and next one is more, and the third one you have 20 times more likely. Interestingly, that one was about statins, which I think is particularly relevant in the current debate that's been in the media recently. So that can distort both, have an enormous effect on patient health, patient safety, healthcare costs. The investigation of this sort of issue tends to be in areas like pharmaceuticals, some certain areas like food and synthetic chemicals, but not a lot of research has been done looking at this problem in other areas, and it would be, I think, this research shows that we need to look more widely. I think it is a much more widespread problem, and it hasn't been documented as widely as I think it exists. Issues around public relations campaigns. I think the issue of uncertainty is quite key here, and so on the one hand you have industry funding campaigns around regulation, for example, to slow down regulation, so they focus on the uncertainty, and 2 major examples are smoking causes cancer and climate change caused by fossil fuels. And then on the other side, you've got an emphasis on certainty, particularly within marketing campaigns, so pharmaceutical industry again, and some synthetic chemicals like weed killers or things like that. And the third issue, we're back to this issue of technoscience, sort of shaping research agendas. And the one thing I want to put on the table is around the prioritisation of science that could give us new technologies versus science that can help us understand the world, which can either inform culture or policy, and the importance of getting a better balance between these sorts of issues. So I would say around all this, values are very key, and there's a few suggestions and arguments that we've been making to help try and deal with some of the problems I've highlighted. And one issue is, one recommendation is around increasing the distance between researchers, so having less corporate funding within universities, which is a very popular thing to recommend at the moment with government trends. But also, I mean, maybe issues around that, around trying to look at the way in which, in somewhere like healthcare, you've got a lot of private charitable funding. That's another way of diversifying research, and maybe that could be a model that is used elsewhere more openly, and maybe using some of the money from the corporate sector that goes into a foundation that is then has a board that has a wider range of interests, so that it's not a direct connection between the corporation and the research. Then, as I was saying, more balance between technoscience and science for understanding and for policy, and then somewhat glibly at the end, more priority for the broader public interest. That's a huge debate in itself, but I think that terribly important is having an eye on research around, instead of just the next technology, what about understanding the potential side effects of new technologies and the lack of research at an early stage. Technologies, particularly in certain areas, regulation always trying to keep up with technologies and often relying on evidence from the corporate sector about the new technologies rather than being able to do independent research. Having that sort of science funded at a much earlier stage in the technological development process. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So the floor is open. We got just under half an hour for discussion. Who would like to start?
Question primarily, I suppose, for Angela. If we think about the scientific evidence base, it seems to me that we don't have a sufficient scientific evidence base because we've, time after time, as you explained very eloquently, we kind of bet the farm on badger culling, and we don't have enough evidence on alternative strategies. Because the question is not, does killing badgers reduce TB? The question is, how can we best reduce the incidence of TB, which for farmers is a very real problem. So on the evidence side, we don't have enough of alternative strategies, so we can't do it, as Roger was talking about yesterday. Scientists can't perform what is road function because we don't know about vulnerability. I'm not sure I agree with you that we don't know what public opinion is. I think there's very good evidence from opinion polls and also from the deliberative exercise that the government carried out in 2005. And I think primarily what we know about public opinion is that most people don't really care. That regardless of whether the government decides to cull or not cull, most people would give a shrug that would make any direction bad. So one wonders quite why so much angst and difficulty and trauma goes into making a decision which for any party doesn't actually carry any political pain, or at least very little pain. Maybe if the Green Party came out for a car, that might be so I wonder whether perhaps if we think about reframing the problem of bovine TB, whether we can actually maybe go back and reframe it as a simple one of political science, that this is actually more a problem of managing stakeholders and governance than it is about science, or it is about public opinion, or regulatory tool. And part of the problem why we continually go back to badger culling is the key stakeholder of farming, whose cooperation is required for the delivery of a whole host of other policy objectives in food and animal health. Kind of have to be kept, if not sweet, then at least not actively in opposition.
Okay. As regards the evidence base, yes. Yeah. I mean, when we have randomised control trials, we have loads and loads and loads of them, and then we do a Cochrane review, and then Cochrane review says, oh, I don't know, and so on. In this case, we have one trial, and there's probably not going to be another one because it costs so much. And so the amount that we don't know about all these things is huge. On the public opinion, I think you're right on the polls that are there, but they are very strategic polls. The other thing that we do know is that opinion between kind of, if you like, urban people and rural people is much, much more complicated. But what is going on in the public debate, and has been for a very long time, is kind of an accepted truth of kind of an imagined public that absolutely won't stand for it. And that actually helps both sides of the argument, because it allows, particularly the kind of farming position, to talk about being marginalised and not looked after properly. And of course farmers are, as you say, in a very difficult position. So it kind of plays into a very long-standing rhetoric of kind of marginalised rural communities and so on. And we do have, a couple of deliberative exercises that are set up in very particular ways. What science-wise is bringing out is, yet again, the issue that if you actually sit people down with the complexity of the situation, what you don't get is what's happening in the public debate. So there's kind of a front stage and a backstage. In terms of, particularly the front stage argument, I think, is political. And in terms of understanding what's happening around some aspects of the policy, most recently, that's very much political. It is also interesting, though, that the same set of policy documents that are enabling the cull and enabling the shouting are also enabling opening up a lot of other options, including enabling testing vaccination, looking at how all the regulation around farming and testing and so on and so forth. So there has actually in recent years been a bit of a process of opening up that's going on. It's just that it's happening behind the scenes. You could basically say, well, it's just political, make it about all politics, and that's pretty much what the chief scientist was saying yesterday. It could be done that way. I don't know if it would actually get us any further, though. Particularly because now we're reaching a position where it is largely politicised, and so effectively one administration comes in and the policy goes in the opposite direction, and the policymakers have to square that circle of the changing priority with the complexity of the situation. So I'm not sure I'm completely convinced that just kind of saying it's just politics, we'll wash our hands of it is going to help either. I think it's more a matter of bringing the politics in and acknowledging the values and the history and all the rest of it is kind of what needs to happen, and so that it's not possible for people to kind of stand up and shout and say, well, the science says this, therefore, because that gets us nowhere.
Okay, I think Beth.
Yeah. Thank you.
To say something.
Beth Taylor, just left the Institute of Physics. I'd like to ask two questions, but they're really short, so I thought you might let me. One is of Tim, and it's really just to confirm my understanding about have you given us a great gift. Because a lot of the time at this conference I felt as though I'm struggling to see where science as evidence stops and science as advice starts. And I just want to check, is that the difference between episteme and phronesis? And then a question for for Stuart. I understand your anxiety about the short-termism of corporate-funded research in universities. But surely the point is, it's not filling a vacuum. It's not that if that research was not done, somehow publicly funded long-term research would come in and substitute it. It's additional research, and in that sense, could you see it as a bad thing?
Okay, Tim, do you want to start?
I'm struggling with your question because I don't think that. Background. I have found it a real help, or when I came across pragmatic philosophy, and that put a lot of things, clarified things. It's interesting. I had breakfast with Roger this morning, and Roger had to, he's back off, and so he said, "I won't be. What are you going to say?" And we had a conversation, and
just ignore.
The financial crisis made me, as a physicist, I'm a trained physicist, really question what I had grown up with. Because I knew what had happened, I knew how science had been used. The Institute of Physics, mathematics department said, one of our great contributions to the British economy is our involvement in finance. All goes wrong, everybody walks away. Nothing to do with me go. And it was a real problem for me because I couldn't justifiably do that. I couldn't within myself. It's a responsibility thing. I have a responsibility. And I really struggled with a lot of things for a long time. And I was fortunate in working with a sociologist in Edinburgh who was very supportive and helping me. And it was really when Donald Mackenzie made an elliptical link, or a tangential link, between Poincaré and pragmatism. And then I started following up on pragmatism. Pragmatism is all about, it's the usefulness of knowledge. Truth is a slippery concept in pragmatism. This is what they try and truth. So episteme is difficult. And so pragmatism said, I know where you're coming from. What I was doing is, you say it's a fact, but what? Yeah.
I agree with you.
That's the point. It's difficult. These things are difficult, and we have to be careful with them. And so, phronesis to me it's a pragmatic conception of knowledge. So, because I was expecting, and I was very fortunate for the previous speaker used about epistemic knowledge. You know, there is this emphasis in scientific culture to focus on epistemic knowledge. I come from the vernacular, I come from industry. So naturally I have an affinity with phronesis, with practical knowledge. I don't, it's like, does this mean that you diminish episteme? No, it doesn't mean I diminish episteme, but I think there needs to be a rebalancing. My big paper is there should be a rebalancing. There is an overemphasis on the competition metaphor in economics. There needs to be a rebalancing to the cooperation. There is an overemphasis of episteme in scientific practice. There needs to be a rebalancing to phronesis, because a lot of, when policymakers turn to scientists, I think we need to offer them episteme, but actually what we should be able to... Yeah, my son says he needs chocolate. Well, he doesn't say he needs chocolate. But my son says he needs things. I have a responsibility to tell him, no, he needs to eat his tomato pasta. But so it's that. I think I think if I have a gift, it's read Susan Hack, read Cheryl Mesack, read The New Pragmatist. They're really easy to read. They're not like analytic philosophers, really. Hilary Putnam, a mathematician whose book is The Collapse of the Fact-Value Dichotomy. That's really useful for me as a mathematician, to read a mathematician who says it's just daft. And that was a big breakthrough for me. And that's what I think, as a former IOP executive, that is what I would say to you. It's not phronesis, it's new pragmatism.
Okay, Stuart?
Yes, on private funding and the whole issue of if it comes when there's nothing else offered. I think there are a number of issues here, and what is the alternative model I presented is that if there is extra money, can it be given in a way that distances the interests so that it can have less strings attached and have more involvement of other stakeholders who have competing interests. And I think there is potential there, although there are not too many practical implementations of that. I think some research around genetics and citizen panels, citizen juries on genetics, where they were co-funded by Greenpeace and Unilever on both sides of the argument, is an example of that sort of Now, that wasn't through a foundation. A foundation is one way, but also competing interests agreeing to co-fund a study is another way. I think that there is a lot more room for that sort of alternative funding model. I think there is a great danger that if we just say, well, if we take the money, it's the argument that more is always better. I'm not convinced by that one either. There are some paths of research that maybe we should be slowing down in because they're leading to technologies that we really don't know what's going to happen. They're scaring the public, and we need to, if there isn't the funding available, to look at the side effects, dangers, social concerns around those technologies, then we shouldn't be funding the research to develop that technology further. That's quite an outspoken critique, but I think, you know, research is always a choice around priorities with the money that you have available, and skills is also an input to that. And if you allow too much corporate or military interest, it biases the skills base in particular directions as well. We have a lot of arms industry funding school science, which I think is extremely problematic, and funding science festivals. And so you're having this whole shift that I think we need to stand up against it at some level.
Okay, Philip first, and then...
Actually, because I intend I'm an experimental physicist, so the idea of pragmatic knowledge sits incredibly well with me. So let's leave aside E equals mc squared. I drop this, it falls to the earth with, you know, acceleration due to gravity. I can write that down as F is equal mg, right? So that's a model, but it's a damn good model, and it's as close as a fact as we get in science. So pragmatically, it's a fact. That's, I think we're pretty well in agreement there. The other interesting thing is on the probabilistic aspects. You know, you said outside normal lab conditions. This works due to quantum mechanics, as you know, which is inherently a probabilistic framework, and yet it makes incredibly accurate predictions on the basis of multiple trials, etc., etc., etc. Normal distribution, you know that, you know, you can make accurate predictions, even though each event has got a certain probability. You can make very accurate predictions. So it seems to me that even if your whole underpinnings are probabilistic, that still doesn't mean that everything is up in the air. You can make very well-defined quantitative predictions. In some cases.
Where do I start? It's not where do I start, it's how do I approach it. There's lots of things. Oscar Morgenstern did his work was motivated to do his work on game theory with John Newman, because he had this model. I like this model. It's a story. So in the Sherlock Holmes stories, where it's like that story, it's always, Sherlock Holmes stories always good. I can talk about it. Sat on the plane platform, Watson talking to Holmes. And Watson says, it looks like we've escaped Moriarty. And Holmes turns to Watson and says, no, what you fail to understand, we're dealing with an intellect as good as me. The point is that there's this issue in economics, and Morgenstern was an Austrian economics, and there's this issue with economics, is if everybody's rational, economics stops working, nothing happens. Everybody does what the model tells them. You know, there's an equilibrium, nothing happens. And this is the thing, and what Morgan said is there's volition, human volition, and this is why social sciences and human sciences are so important in economics. There's volition. There's the perverse. Laplace is the demon was never perverse. Maxwell's demon was never perverse. In the social science, in the human, you have the perverse. You have somebody doing something stupid. Berry Bank collapsed because Nick Leeson did something stupid.
So the system driven by the outliers.
Sorry?
The system is driven by the outliers.
I don't think. You see, what you're saying is extreme value. I can do mathematics, or colleagues at my department do mathematics on, and we can accommodate those. But there is something a bit, and this is the difference between the epistemic uncertainty and the aleatory. Keynes described it as irreducible uncertainty. Knight described it as Knightian. Economists talk about. And there's this thing. Everything works in physics because they're stable. It's ergodic. It's repeatable. Laplace said, kill the discussion about moral certainty in mathematics by saying that moral and mathematical certainty are equivalent for repeatable events.
Encouragement along in this case is even as well as I did, only so many, a very, very small subset of physical systems are linear.
But the point I'm making is on a lot of physical interpretation, or interpretations of probability coming from the physical sciences, rest on repeatability. You cannot rely on that in the social and human sciences. And so you have to have this, my interest is in how do we construct a moral theory of probability, not a moral theory in a theological but in terms dealing with these problems where we don't know the distribution, even if it has outliers, even if it's Pareto, even if it's perverse. We have to still be able to make judgments about the future.
First, yes, you behind there.
So, Alistair Taylor, University of Nottingham. It's a question to, sort of comment to Stuart's view of things. I'll put my conflict of interest up first. Part of my job is to actually bring in business and industry to sponsor research at the university. But I share some of the concerns, but I'm not blind to them. But I would challenge the view that all industry-funded research is short-term. I can give examples of very long-term projects that have gone on for over a decade, that have been started
Could you
off.
speak up a bit?
Sorry, I'm losing my voice slightly. I can give examples of very long-term industrially funded research at this university, projects that go on for 10, 15 years. They then generate publicly funded fundamental research outputs as well. Also examples of where industry has been slightly ahead of the game than the public funding because it sees the challenges coming from regulatory issues, from environmental and sustainability issues. And so it comes to universities because it sees expertise there which it will benefit its industry facing with these challenges. So I think whilst there are obviously the problems with conflicts of interest and public responsibility, responsible innovation, I think there's also opportunities through industrially sponsored research. And as you say, it's finding the right balance between the two.
Yes, I agree with you. I wouldn't say no industrial research. I probably gave the impression that it's all evil, but no. There is a role. I am worried that the balance has gone rather too far, and it is getting worse. And some academics argue, no, we kind of got it under control, or maybe it's only gone a little bit too far. I mean, I think it went too far a couple of decades ago, and I think it is a problem that, and it's a difficult problem within the economic system and when the policy realm that we have in a neoliberal economic system which emphasises deregulation, and I think that's fundamentally problematic to scientific research because it distorts it in a particular direction. So that's the particular concerns I have.
Yes, please.
So picking up a little bit from where Tim and Phil left, I think we're actually in agreement. And the way I see this, I think you're right to point out that facts as me and Phil in our lab know them are not necessarily applicable. That sort of idea of a fact is not necessarily applicable in the social and human sciences. But I think this conference is about the interface between natural scientists, physical scientists, and the social scientists, or at least that's how I understood it. And so while we've got to get the understanding in our heads that you guys can't maybe talk about facts the same way we can, I think also what I've not seen a huge amount of is their understanding that sometimes we can tell you a fact. And I don't know, I think sometimes you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because sometimes facts aren't valid doesn't mean that they can't be valid facts. You know, I dropped this, it's 9.81 meters a second squared. That is the acceleration due to gravity. And I can tell you probably how uncertain we are on that as well. So sometimes it's not a catch-all basically. Sometimes you can't be that certain and a fact might not be a fact, but sometimes you can. And I think that's important to realise.
You want to come in, Angela?
Something very briefly I wanted to say is that I think it's very easy for us to get into a dichotomy between the social sciences and the natural sciences, particularly the kinds of sciences that I study, which is not just life sciences but field sciences, which are really, really, really messy. Is that there are definitely differences between the social sciences and the natural sciences, and I've actually written quite a bit about how that affects communication. I take the point, certainly at some point there are facts, but there's a huge spread between the two. I think there's kind of a sliding scale going on here, and some of what Tim's talking about, I think to say it's just the social and the human and the natural is fine, I think that's possibly a bit of a mistake.
And I am in the middle.
Yeah.
I come from your tradition, and I've always struggled with, no, it is a fact. It is a fact that the acceleration will be 9.8. But Philip used something which is a bit slippier, which is E equals mc squared is a fact. Yeah. So it's slippier in the sense that the general population will think of a fact in a way. It's like risk. The general population think of a risk in a way. Economists think of risk in a very different way. And so if you say a fact is that people can't live in Fukushima. Is it a fact that people can't live in Fukushima because Fukushima Daiichi power plant was badly designed? It is a fact that the space shuttle blew up. Is it a fact that the space shuttle blew up because the O-rings were frozen? You see, the problem with the climate science debate, I think, is it's a fact. Well, actually, it's a model.
So
what the mc squared is a different model from any
and also, I come from a new pragmatist thing, which is, I agree completely. I have no issue with scientific facts and our understanding of scientific facts. But as you move away outside the laboratory, outside this stable system, I live in Scotland. I'm not going to attempt to do a Scottish accent, but you cannot change the laws of physics, Captain Kirk. You know, that is difficult. You can change the laws of economics. You can change the laws of finance. So that's the issue. So, yeah.
I think that was kind of a point. But the thing I think you've got to be careful though is because it's easy to spread then mistrust and mistrust. I've heard it a lot of times. Oh, you scientists, you can say anything you want, and I can't. If I'm doing my job and I'm interpreting my data properly, there is a right answer.
You have to justify. We as scientists have to justify. And that's what the point is, we have to justify. It's not about producing the facts, it's about justifying the statement.
I think there are two last questions, one over there and Sujatha.
Hugh Burkhardt, Nottingham. I just want to point out that commercial research has actually led to many of the most fundamental decisions. If if you think of information theory and the transistor, which were produced at Bell Labs, it's almost an argument for monopoly, that they were able to take a long-term view, which when they were broken up, didn't survive. Similarly, the internet was produced by the Department of Defense Research, coming from physics. A huge amount of the physics was fundamental physics was funded almost not incidentally by these organizations. And it was because of a public perception that it paid off. Medical research funding leapt enormously after the penicillin and the war. Physics research leapt enormously after radar and the bomb. One of the things that I'm concerned of in educational research is that there has not been a payoff like that, so the funding remains derisory. So the short-termism is actually a societal and an industrial problem, it seems to me, not just one with respect to their scientific research. Any comments?
I think that there is a difference now to in the past, and yes, some corporations had, Shell is another example, funded very long-term research, and I think most of that has been cut as we have moved to a much more short-term economic system, an economic system that emphasises shorter and shorter terms. So it's not just a corporate problem, and I think this is part of it around government trying to push an economic agenda on publicly funded research. But I also think as many examples as you can give me of advances that have given us useful technologies, I can give you examples of technologies that have led to major environmental problems. And you know, the acceleration of weapons technologies over the 20th century has been absolutely horrendous in the destructive capability. We started the 20th century with rifles, and we ended the 20th century with thermonuclear weapons, and an emphasis on...
Maybe the AK-47 has done more damage than the nuclear bomb.
I would agree, but nevertheless, we have created a capacity to end the human race, and we came very close during the Cold War to doing that, and the nuclear weapons threat has not gone away, despite the fact it's not in the public realm. So I think these issues around these issues are still very much there, and I think a dominance of military funding in the past, and some of it persists today, has given us a very particular trajectory for weapons development and destructiveness of weapons, and also for certain technologies that have spun off into the civilian realm. You get jet aircraft, which have, yes, been very useful, but they're also very polluting, and so you kind of have to look at this in a much wider scope. If you have a much broader base of funding that has less powerful interests pushing a particular narrow agenda, then I think you will get far more useful science and technology out of that. And I think we can do better, and I think we have to do better, because we are facing major environmental problems, and we are facing, we still haven't got rid of some of the issues around conflict and the threat of nuclear war.
Okay, last one, Sujata, please.
Sujata Raman from University of Nottingham. I think it's important to keep a couple of things in mind in relation to this debate, partly from the flow on the issue of scientific facts. The first is, what are the conditions under which a fact is a fact? I think that's one of the key motivations behind some of the sociology, social science work in this area. But secondly, what are the conditions? What's the context in which we care what these conditions are? So when you say, Phil, that you drop something and you know the law of gravity works, I doubt that there are very many people who are interested in challenging or sort of contesting or looking at what are the conditions under which that fact is a fact. It's just that, well, they might, well, at least at present, you know, that's not really an issue. But when we talk about things like climate change or badger culling and what's the impact of badger culling, and when some of these facts are presented without that context, without sort of explicit discussion of the conditions under which, you know, a particular model is used to promote a particular economic policy, as you were talking about, I think those are the conditions under which, you know, these things start to become important. So when you respond, when you say, you know, you do an experiment in the lab, or you have E equals MC squared.
It's not about that specific. You know, go back a few hundred years, you're not going to find gravity in the theory of gravitation particularly well established. And how is that established? That's what it's about. And that's exactly the same with global evidence, and how data and evidence feed into that discussion.
Yeah, but I think what the point here is that when particular forms of evidence is being used to support certain policies, then people want to know what are the conditions under which those facts, that evidence, and how might they be interpreted. That's where the stakes are.
You find exactly the same thing with regard to theory of gravitation.
Yeah, but well, sometimes those things get closed down, and you know, now we are in a situation where some of these facts are being opened up, if you like, for to understand them.
Do you have a question to the panelists?
No.
Okay, fine. Thank you all very much for another sparkling debate, and let's break for coffee and come back at 11:45.